When my girlfriend stepped away from the table to check on the dessert order, the elderly man beside me leaned across and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. His grip was surprisingly firm for someone his age, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Don't let her take you to the signing appointment tomorrow, Harold. Read page 3. Then he pulled back, lifted his coffee cup as if nothing had happened, and by the time my girlfriend returned 2 minutes later, he was gone. His chair empty, coat gone, like he'd never been there at all. I sat there with the folded paper against my palm, the warmth of the community center hall buzzing around me. It was the annual fundraiser for the Oakville Veterans Auxiliary, the kind of evening filled with donated auction items, slow-roasted salmon, and people who genuinely cared about doing something good. My girlfriend Sandra had organized most of it. She squeezed my shoulder as she sat back down. "Herb's daughter wants to speak with us after the speeches. Something about the legacy giving program." She smiled at me. That warm and practiced smile I'd trusted completely for almost 2 years. "You're going to love what they've set up for long-term donors. My name is Harold Beaumont. I'm 68 years old. I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, and I spent 34 years teaching high school history at the same school where I'd once been a student. My wife, Catherine, died of a stroke 4 years ago, 3 months before I was supposed to retire. We'd planned everything together. The trip to the Maritimes, the little vegetable garden she wanted in the backyard, the grandchildren we were going to spoil rotten once our son, Michael, and his wife finally got around to having some. Catherine died on a Tuesday. By Friday, all of it was just a list of things that would never happen. I met Sandra at the church community breakfast the following spring. She was volunteering, ladling out oatmeal with cheerful efficiency, asking every person who came through whether they'd heard about the Veterans Auxiliary and the work they were doing for families of fallen soldiers. She seemed to genuinely care. She asked me about Catherine when I mentioned I'd lost my wife, and she actually listened to what I said instead of waiting for her turn to talk. We started getting coffee after the breakfast, then dinners. By autumn, she had a drawer in my house, and by the following spring, she had met Michael during one of his visits from Vancouver. Michael hadn't said much about Sandra directly, but the week after she left, he'd called me and said, "Dad, you seem happy. Just make sure you're thinking clearly about the financial stuff." I'd told him everything was fine and changed the subject. That was 8 months ago. The men's room at the Oakville Community Center was mercifully empty. I locked the door of the stall and unfolded the piece of paper with hands that I couldn't quite keep steady. It wasn't a letter. It was a printout. 3 pages, folded together. The first page was a bank transfer record from a trust account in my name, a trust I didn't know existed, to something called Anchor Legacy Foundation, registered in Ontario. $140,000, transferred 6 weeks ago. My signature was at the bottom of the authorization. I had never signed that document. The second page was a property assessment notice for my house on Lakeview Crescent, currently under review as a potential asset contribution to the Anchor Legacy Foundation's endowment fund. A note in the margin, handwritten, "Beaumont confirmation pending Tuesday appointment." Tomorrow was Tuesday. The third page was a legal form, a representation agreement giving Sandra Colville full authority to act on my behalf in financial and medical decisions in the event of my cognitive incapacity. Attached was a psychological assessment from a Dr. Peter Varga stating that I exhibited early-stage vascular dementia consistent with my age and medical history. The assessment was dated 3 weeks ago. I had never been to Dr. Peter Varga's office. I had never had a psychological assessment of any kind, but there was my signature, right above a notary stamp. I stood there in the stall, gripping that printout until my knuckles went pale. Then I folded it back the way it had come, tucked it into my jacket, splashed cold water on my face at the sink, and walked back out into the hall where the speeches were about to begin. Sandra was waiting at the table. She tilted her head. "You look white as a sheet. Are you feeling all right?" "Tired," I said. "Long week." "Well, sit down. The mayor's about to talk, and then it's the legacy program presentation." She patted my hand. Her nails were immaculate. "You've been so wonderful about all of this, Harold. Catherine would have been so proud." I smiled and said nothing. 30 minutes later, I made my excuse, said I needed to check on something in my car, and walked out the side entrance into the cold November air. I stood on the pavement for a moment. There was a coffee shop across the street, still open, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and handwritten chalkboard menus. The elderly man from the dinner was already inside, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of him. His name was Gord Whitfield. He told me that immediately, with the directness of someone who had decided that formality was a waste of what time he had left. He was 74, retired from the RCMP after 30 years, and his younger brother Dennis had died in a long-term care facility called Anchor Comfort Residence 11 months ago. Dennis had been 71, in good health, and worth just under $400,000 in home equity and retirement savings when Sandra Colville entered his life. She met Dennis at a Legion brunch, Gord said. In Mississauga, she was volunteering with the Veterans Families Program, same as she did with you. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His voice was steady, but there was something sitting behind his eyes that had been sitting there for a long time. Dennis thought she was the one. Moved fast. 6 months, and she was running his calendar, his banking, his medical appointments. By the time I realized what was happening, the representation agreement was already filed. I tried to get a lawyer, tried to get the police to look at it. Civil matter, they said. Everything was legally executed. Dennis had been declared incompetent. He couldn't testify on his own behalf. What happened to him? I asked, though part of me already didn't want to know. Gord was quiet for a moment. He died in that facility 7 months after he was admitted. Death certificate said, cardiac event. Dennis ran 5 kilometers every second morning. His heart was fine before Sandra. He looked at me directly. I've spent the last year building a file. There are at least 8 other men that we've confirmed, all of them older, all of them widowers, most of them with some connection to veterans services or church communities, all of them with property or significant RRSP savings. All of them in the process of having their assets moved into Anchor Legacy Foundation, which Sandra controls as executive director. Dr. Varga handles the psychological assessments that give her the legal basis to take over their affairs. The foundation is the vehicle that moves the money, and Anchor Comfort Residence is where the men go when they're no longer useful. I thought about the appointment tomorrow. The one Sandra had told me was about estate planning, legacy giving, she'd called it. Who gave you my documents? I asked. Gord's expression shifted slightly. The notary who processed your representation agreement noticed something. Margaret Osei. She has a small firm in Burlington. She'd handled the notarization for 2 other men before you men who turned out to be Sandra's targets. When she saw your paperwork, she recognized the pattern. She couldn't refuse to process it without just cause, but she could make copies. And she could find someone who'd know what to do with them. How did she find you? Her son went to school with Dennis's boy. The world is smaller than it looks. He slid a business card across the table. A burner number written on the back in ballpoint. I have a contact at the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, someone who's been watching this for months but couldn't move without hard evidence. The legal documents are all clean on the surface. What they need is the source records. Sandra keeps a financial ledger on her laptop. Not on the cloud, she's careful. Local drive, encrypted. But the password was something I found through Margaret, from a document Sandra once emailed from that machine. He paused. We need someone on the inside to copy that ledger. Someone she hasn't cut off yet. I looked down at my coffee. Outside the window, the street lights on the Lakeview Road reflected off the wet pavement in long orange streaks. I thought about Dennis Whitfield running 5 kilometers every second morning. I thought about the other men. Gord had mentioned 8 of them, sitting in rooms in a care facility, cut off from their families, their money already gone. I thought about Michael calling from Vancouver saying, just make sure you're thinking clearly about the financial stuff. Tell me what I need to know, I said. We spent 90 minutes going through it. Sandra kept her laptop in the locked second bedroom of my house that she'd set up as a home office. I'd given her that space without thinking twice about it. She'd said she needed somewhere quiet for foundation paperwork. The key was in an envelope in the top drawer of her dresser, which I'd seen her retrieve more than once. The ledger file was named something innocuous, part of a folder labeled administrative. Gord had the password. All I needed was a USB drive and time alone with that computer. She's going to be in damage control mode tonight, Gord said. You left the dinner early. She'll be watching you when you get home. Play confused. Let her think you're just tired and stressed. She'll want to keep you calm until tomorrow's appointment. That's when she planned to have you sign the final asset transfer. She needs tomorrow to go smoothly. And if she realizes I know, she'll move fast. Dr. Varga is on call. The men she uses to do her transport, 2 of them, they've handled this before. There was a man in Burlington last year who tried to push back. He had a fall down his front steps the following week. Broken hip. He withdrew all his objections while he was in hospital. Gord's voice stayed even. She's not going to let a problem walk around loose. I drove home slowly. The house on Lakeview Crescent looked exactly as it always had. Sandra's car in the driveway, warm light in the front window. The same house Catherine and I had bought 26 years ago, where Michael had grown up, where we'd had Christmas dinners and August barbecues. And every ordinary day of a life I'd never thought to call anything but lucky. Standing in the driveway, I felt the weight of all of it, not grief. Exactly. But something adjacent to it. The understanding that something you loved had been hollowed out from the inside without your knowing. Sandra met me at the door. She was wearing the blue cardigan I'd bought her last Christmas, and her expression was all soft concern. I was getting worried. You just disappeared. Sorry, I said. Felt a bit off. The cold air helped. Come in. Come in. She steered me toward the living room. I made tea. Dr. Varga was there, sitting in the armchair by the window, jacket still on, holding a mug like he'd just dropped in for a friendly visit. He stood when I came in. Harold, good to see you. Sandra mentioned you weren't feeling your best tonight. He was maybe 55, careful looking. The kind of person who chose every word before releasing it. I just thought it would be good to check in. I didn't show what I felt. I sat down. I let Sandra hand me the tea. I let Varga ask me gentle questions about my sleep and my appetite, and whether I'd been feeling confused lately, mixing up dates or losing track of conversations. I said I was tired. I said perhaps I needed to take things a bit more slowly. Sandra sat close to me on the sofa and held my hand and said softly that it was okay, that these things happened, that the appointment tomorrow would help us put the right supports in place. I let her talk. I watched her face while she did. There's a particular skill you develop after 34 years of teaching teenagers. You learn to recognize when someone is performing sincerity rather than feeling it. The eyes are slightly ahead of the emotion. The warmth is consistent in a way that real warmth never quite is. Because real warmth has variation, it sputters and surges. Sandra's warmth was metered, perfect, calibrated to whatever the room required. I'd always thought that was just how some people were. Steady and composed. Now I understood it differently. Varga left around 10:30. Sandra walked him to the door, and I heard them murmuring briefly in the front hall. I couldn't make out the words. When she came back, she said he was a wonderful man, so dedicated, and that she felt so much better having him involved. She helped me to bed like I was something fragile and kissed my forehead, and said that tomorrow, everything would start to feel more manageable. We're going to take such good care of you, she said. After her footsteps faded down the hall and the light under her door went dark, I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. At 2:40 in the morning, I got up. The house was completely silent. Sandra slept in the second bedroom most nights now. She'd started doing that 3 months ago, told me her insomnia was keeping her up and she didn't want to disturb me. I'd accepted it without thinking much about it. I understood that differently now, too. Her office door opened with the key from her dresser drawer, which I retrieved in the dark without making a sound. The laptop was on the desk, sleeping. I entered the password Gord had given me. The screen came up. The folder was exactly where he'd said. I found the ledger inside a subfolder labeled Foundation Administration Year 3. It was a spreadsheet. Names in the left column, dates, asset descriptions, dollar amounts, status notes, Dennis Whitfield, $382,000. Status, closed. There were 7 other names below his, some still marked active, amounts ranging from $200,000 to over $500,000. At the very bottom, in a row highlighted in yellow, Harold Beaumont, $415,000. Status, pending Tuesday. My hands were steady as I plugged in the USB drive. The file began copying. The longest 4 minutes of my life. I was watching the progress bar when I heard the floor creak behind me. Sandra was standing in the doorway in her housecoat. She wasn't startled. She wasn't confused. She looked at the laptop screen and the USB drive, and her face simply settled into something very still and very cold. The way a road looks just before the ice forms. I thought you'd be further along in the process before you got curious, she said. Most men are. Most men probably don't have someone warn them ahead of time. Something moved across her face. Not quite fear, but close to it. Gord Whitfield. It wasn't a question. He's been a nuisance. His brother is dead. His brother had a cardiac event. People die, Harold. That's what old people do. She moved into the room and I saw the phone in her hand. I actually liked you. You know, you're sharper than the others. You listen. You have good stories. I was almost sorry this one had to go the way it goes. Was any of it real? She considered this with what seemed like genuine thought. Parts. I don't dislike you. But this is a business, and you have assets that are doing absolutely nothing. Sitting in a house you rattle around in alone. And in RRSP, you're too cautious to spend. I'm just redistributing Dennis Whitfield's money. Gregory, what was the Burlington man's name? I don't know who you're talking about. But her hand tightened on the phone. Whatever you think you've found on that computer, Harold, think about your position. You have a signed representation agreement on file. A psychological assessment. 2 witnesses who attended tonight's event and will testify to your confusion. I have a very good lawyer. What do you have? I pulled the USB drive from the port. This. And a notary named Margaret Osei who's been documenting your operation for 8 months. And Gord Whitfield, who has a contact at the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit who's been waiting for exactly this. The stillness in her face broke just slightly. You've been planning this? No. I've been a high school history teacher my whole life. I know what happens when people assume the people they're exploiting aren't paying attention. She raised her phone and dialed. Peter, we have a problem. Beaumont has the ledger. Yes. Bring the car. We're moving to the facility protocol. She hung up and looked at me with something that in another life might have passed for regret. This didn't have to go this way. You killed Dennis Whitfield. Dennis had a cardiac event. You killed him. And at least one other person. And you locked 8 men away from their families and took everything they'd spent their lives building. My voice stayed level. I was surprised by that. And you thought nobody would notice. Because we're just old men. Lonely. Trusting. Too proud to ask for help. You are. Some of us are. Some of us aren't. I heard a car pulling up outside. The window in Sandra's office looked onto the back garden. Single story dropped to the grass below. Not nothing at 68. With a left knee that had needed a scope 2 years ago. But not impossible either. I'd coached rugby for 12 years. I knew how to fall. Sandra stepped toward me. Harold, don't be dramatic. Come sit down. Peter can help you. We can say this was a moment of confusion. That you got into my computer without understanding. I threw the laptop. Not at her at the window. The glass went with a sound like a thunderclap, and Sandra screamed and grabbed for me. But I was already at the sill. Already through. Dropping into the cold dark of my own backyard, landing hard on my left side in the frosted grass, the knee screaming, rolling the way you roll when you don't have any other choice. I came up moving. Across the yard, through the gate I'd left unlatched on my way in, out onto the back lane. Gord's car was parked 2 streets over, exactly where he'd said it would be. I was limping badly, and my left hand was bleeding from the window glass, and the cold was getting into my chest in a way that reminded me I was 68 and not 30, but the USB drive was in my jacket pocket. I could feel it there, small and solid. The burner phone rang before I reached the car. I heard the alarm, Gord said. Are you out? I'm out. I have it. A pause. Then, quietly, good man. He picked me up at the end of Thornton Avenue. I got into the passenger seat and he handed me a folded cloth for my hand without saying anything about it. And we drove through the empty streets toward the address he'd already prepared. A guest suite above the garage of a retired colleague's house in Brampton, warm and plain, with a first aid kit on the kitchen table and a pot of coffee already made. 3 hours later, RCMP Financial Crimes executed a search warrant on Anchor Comfort residence. Sandra was arrested at my house on Lakeview Crescent. Dr. Varga was taken into custody at his clinic. 2 associates were arrested at the facility. Margaret Osei provided a formal statement. The ledger on the USB drive was entered as evidence, along with 8 months of documentation, financial records, and the testimony of family members who had been trying for years to reach their fathers and brothers and uncles through a wall of legal paperwork that Sandra had erected around them. Michael flew in from Vancouver that weekend. He sat across from me at the kitchen table of the guest suite in Brampton and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad, just that. I told him I was all right." He said he knew. He said he should have pushed harder, should have asked more questions, should have come out sooner. I told him to stop. That wasn't the lesson. The trial took place the following autumn. Sandra's defense argued that the representation agreement was properly executed, that my credibility was compromised by the very psychological assessment she had manufactured, and that the ledger was circumstantial. The Crown's forensic accountant dismantled all of it in 2 days of testimony. Margaret Osei testified for a full afternoon. Gord testified about Dennis. 3 other family members testified about what had happened to their fathers. I testified for 2 days. Sandra's lawyer attempted to suggest I had shown signs of confusion and paranoia consistent with cognitive decline. My own physician of 14 years told the court that my last full cognitive assessment, conducted 8 months prior, placed me in the top quartile for my age group. Sandra was convicted on 31 counts, including fraud over $5,000, criminal breach of trust, and elder financial abuse under the criminal code. Dr. Varga received 18 years. Sandra received life, with no eligibility for parole for 17 years. Anchor Legacy Foundation was dissolved by court order. Anchor Comfort Residence was placed under receivership. The residents transferred to properly licensed care facilities, their remaining assets frozen pending restitution proceedings. I got my house back, my accounts, my name on my own documents, some things you don't get back. I had loved Sandra, or loved the person I had believed she was, the warm woman ladling oatmeal at the church breakfast, who actually listened when I talked about Catherine. That person didn't exist, but the grief of losing her is real, because you can mourn a fiction. You can miss something that was never there. Gord and I meet for coffee on Wednesday mornings. There's a diner in Oakville he likes, old-fashioned, the kind of place that still serves double-doubles in ceramic mugs. We talk about Dennis. We talk about the other men, the ones who are still sorting out what happened to them, which takes much longer than people think. We've started working with a legal clinic in Hamilton that helps elderly people review financial documents they've been asked to sign. Nothing formal, just 2 retired men with some specific experience in a particular kind of problem. Michael visits more often now. He doesn't say much about it directly, but he calls every Sunday without fail, which he didn't before. That's worth something. I still live in the house on Lakeview Crescent. I still have the vegetable garden Catherine wanted in the backyard, which I finally put in the spring after the trial. The tomatoes were not great the first year. The second year was better. I'm told the third year is when you really start to understand what you're doing. When people ask me, and they do ask, sometimes neighbors or old colleagues who've read about the case, why I didn't just leave the night of the dinner and go somewhere safe and let someone else deal with it, I tell them the same thing every time. Because there were 8 men in that facility who couldn't leave. Because Dennis Whitfield ran 5 kilometers every second morning and died in a room he'd been put in against his will. Because Sandra counted on all of us being too old, too embarrassed, too isolated to fight back. And because I spent 34 years teaching young people that the most important moments in history are the ones where ordinary people decided not to look away when they saw something wrong. You don't get to teach that and then not live it. I'm 68 years old. My knee hasn't been right since that drop into the backyard. I take my coffee black and I'm not great with tomatoes yet, and I miss my wife every single day, but I'm home. I'm free, and somewhere in a federal corrections facility, Sandra Colville is learning that the men she chose to exploit were not, in the end, what she believed them to be. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. Gord says Dennis would have liked me. I don't say anything to that because it gets me in the throat every time. But I think about it. And on Wednesday mornings, when we sit in that diner with our ceramic mugs and the November light coming flat through the windows, I think that this is what justice actually looks like most of the time. Not dramatic, not loud, just 2 old men telling the truth and staying in the fight long enough for it to matter. There's a booth in the back of that diner we've started keeping free on Wednesday mornings, just in case someone comes in who needs to sit down with someone who will believe them. The coffee is always hot. The door is always open. And we're not going anywhere.